Hello and welcome back to The Curious Edge, where after a very brief 4-year intermission, we are back to making videos. And today, we're talking about the real King Arthur. I'm sure at one point you've probably heard the name King Arthur, legendary once and future king of the Britons. But where did these legends come from? And are there any grains of truth sprinkled in amongst all the mystical beasts and magical objects? Find out with me today as we dive into the real history of King Arthur. Well, to find out more about the guy, we first have to go back to his time. But just when was the time of Arthur? The first major source we have for the King Arthur tale is the one written by the Welsh cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth in his 12th century manuscript called The History of the Kings of Britain. But this book said he lived 700 years prior, which is plenty of time for some of the details to get muddled, and for exaggerations and fanciful details to be thrown in. However, in essence, any historical Arthur was from the end of the 5th century and was a leader of the Britons, not the English, as England would not exist for another 400 years. So let's look at the Britain of Arthur's time. The last permanently stationed Roman legion left Britain in 406 AD, leaving Britain to fend for itself, and it is believed the first man to rise to power after they left was called Vortigern, by about 425 AD. And historians are pretty sure Vortigern existed, even though we don't know too much about him. Vortigern led a pretty weakened Britain, with constant raids from the Picts and Irish, and a famine on his hands. He needed help. His first port of call was to ask their old overlords, the Romans, for help, and they helped at first. The first 2 times they asked for Rome's help, they were able to send over a legion and help repel the invaders. However, in 446 AD, when the British did send a request for aid called the Groans of the Britons, which read, "The barbarians drive us to the sea drives us to the barbarians. Between these 2 means of death we are either killed or drowned." Rome simply didn't have the troops to spare and left Britain to fend for itself. So this is about the time when Vortigern invited some Anglo-Saxon mercenaries over from Europe to protect the Britons from the Irish and Picts. Now this was a pretty terrible idea. The Saxons themselves were also in quite the pickle, with the collapsing Roman Empire causing great barbarian migrations such as the Visigoths and Huns to the south and east, and rising sea levels flooding their homeland from the north and west. They were already looking for a way out, and Vortigern had just handed them the keys to a large and bountiful territory where the most powerful military force was them. The Saxon mercenaries pretty much immediately betrayed Vortigern and started conquering the country they had just been hired to protect, and according to Gildas, who's a famous historian from the time, had dipped their red and savage tongues in the Western Ocean before they were finally repelled by Ambrosius Aurelianus, the next leader of the Britons. Ambrosius is interesting because not only is he probably a real person, but also supposedly King Arthur's uncle, so he acts as the person who bridges the gap between history and legend. Although, despite initial success from Ambrosius, Gildas does go on to write, "From that time the citizens were sometimes victorious, sometimes the enemy. This continued up to the year of the siege of Badon Hill, and of almost the last great slaughter inflicted upon the rascally crew." So that means the Saxons were defeated at the Battle of Badon Hill. Now, Gildas doesn't actually say Ambrosius was the one leading the British at the Battle of Badon, and from the fact that most historians think the battle, if it took place at all, took place around 500 AD, Ambrosius would have probably been far too old to still be a commander of the British forces. But it is clear that this is the battle, or series of battles, which finally stopped the Saxon invaders. As we know from archaeological evidence such as grave stiles, this is about the time their advance across the country was halted. So while it is unlikely Ambrosius was the one leading the men, there is another man that is said to have led the Britons at the Battle of Badon, and according to legend, he killed 960 men there. King Arthur. On the definite history side of things, historians aren't sure why exactly the Saxons stopped. Many believe that a war leader among the British did band the Britons together and defeat the invading Saxons in a series of battles. Certainly, if the tale of Arthur hadn't been written by Geoffrey, you would need to invent a character like him to make sense of the archaeology at the time. And this individual, even if they're not exactly the Arthur in Geoffrey's story, might certainly have been the primary inspiration for the tale. Now, in a different 6th century document of Gothic history by yet another historian called Jordanes, a king of all the Britons is described called Riothamus, who reigned in the late 5th century. Riothamus was asked by the Romans to help repel barbarians in northern France, and during this campaign, he and his men were betrayed by Burgundians who were also clients of the Romans at the time, These Burgundians then joined the barbarians against the Romans and defeated them. But the most interesting thing about this tale is that Riothamus isn't a name at all. It's a title that means High King or Supreme King, which is precisely what Arthur was. Now, I believe that stories from both Ambrosius and his successor, whoever that may be, who were both leaders of the Britons at different consecutive time periods, have almost certainly fused together in the 700 years since these events occurred, and either one of them could have been the Riothamus campaigning in France. What's important here, though, is the High King of Britain campaigned in France, just as Geoffrey describes Arthur campaigning in France, and the High King of Britain was betrayed, just as betrayal is such a major aspect of the legend of Arthur, first from Lancelot and then from Mordred. But as a small side note before moving on, a lot of you might be thinking that Ambrosius Aurelianus sounds far too Roman of a name for a British king. Well, his name didn't stay as Ambrosius Aurelianus. According to Geoffrey, after seeing a dragon-shaped comet in the sky, he changed his epithet to Pendragon, or Chief Dragon, and began to use a dragon as his sigil. This epithet was then taken by his younger brother, Uther, upon his death, which Uther then of course passed on to his son Arthur. And it is notable to say one of the first sigils used by the House of Wessex, which was a Saxon kingdom that emerged over a large part of the area where the Arthurian legend takes place, uses a white dragon as its sigil. So, to conclude, Arthur was probably based on Dark Age Britons, who rose from the ashes of Roman Britannia to band together its inhabitants against Saxon invaders towards the end of the 5th century. So now we have a better understanding of the possible King Arthur figure. Join me next time where we learn about the castles, swords and knights of the real King Arthur. But until then, thanks for watching guys, remember to like the video if you did, and subscribe if you want to see future videos on topics like the lost letters of the English alphabet, or why most Dutch houses should really be underwater. And if you want to support the channel, check out my game on Steam. It's a comedic fantasy RPG called Quest, and it's available right now. Until next time guys, goodbye!